Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. I'm Nena Bardwaj. Constitutional Relations Secretary Michael Russell today set out the actions the Scottish Government is taking to protect Scotland as much as possible from the threats of Brexit. In a statement to the Scottish Parliament, the Secretary warned that an unprecedented number of pieces of legislation, known as statutory instruments to prepare Scottish laws for Brexit, will place a heavy burden on the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government. We have a clip of the statement for you now.
Anna Cullen, Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, on the 11th of September 1997, 21 years ago to the very day, the people of Scotland voted in a referendum to re-establish the Scottish Parliament. That referendum was a recognition of the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs, to quote the Claim of Right. But instead of celebrating on this 21st birthday of devolution, we are instead witnessing the sovereign right being treated with contempt as we face the most crucial and damaging change to our lives and prospects that any of us here will have known. Despite the overwhelming vote in Scotland to remain in the EU, in less than 7 months' time, the UK Government intends to take Scotland and the rest of the UK out of the EU. It intends to do so despite the vote of the people of Scotland against that step. It intends to do so despite the views of this Parliament. And it intends to do so despite the fact that it lacks any workable plan and it doesn't know what the consequences will be thereafter. Presiding Officer, there is a vanishingly short window, some 198 days now, for agreement on the terms of withdrawal. In addition, discussions on the shape of a political declaration about a framework for future relationships are deadlocked by a UK government unable to move for fear of destabilising the Conservative Party. Of course, Brexit is in reality only the latest round in a 40-year-long civil war within the Conservative Party about Europe. The latest battlefield in that war is the so-called Chequers Agreement. The EU have been clear that proposals on customs and trade in goods are not acceptable. If the Prime Minister cannot soften her proposals, and she has at least 80 of her own MPs prepared to die in the political ditch because, as far as they're concerned, the Chequers plan is too soft, then the risk of exiting in March with no agreement on the terms of exit and no more than a commitment to further negotiations is very real. Now, Presiding Officer, there are some in this chamber that are trying to tell us that we have to choose between these warring factions. But that is a false choice. Let me make that absolutely clear at the outset. No deal is impossible and unthinkable. The Chequers deal is impractical and unworkable. And a Brexit with next to no detail about future relationship, a so-called blind Brexit, would be completely unacceptable. So we must find something better. What a mess the Tories have made of it. They should be hanging their heads in silent shame in this chamber this afternoon. The Scottish Government has, however, always made a distinction between the politics of Brexit and the absolute necessity of doing everything we can to ensure no legislative cliff edge. We are committed solidly and completely to taking every action to ensure as little damage to Scotland as possible. The publication in August of the first batch of no-deal technical notices laid bare not just the appalling irresponsibility of all those involved, but also illustrated the stark reality of what a no-deal would mean for Scottish businesses and citizens. Reading those notices, I was struck again and again that there is a simple solution that would avoid all this damage: staying in the European Union. That should still be our aim, but we should also be prepared to compromise if others will compromise. Accordingly, we will continue to make the case vigorously for membership of the European single market and the customs union, and to set out the implications of other options and the impact they would have on Scotland's future. We will also, regrettably, have to work as hard as we can to prepare for a no-deal should one occur. Presiding Officer, I made a statement in June where I advised that the Scottish Government was intensifying its preparations for all exit possibilities in order to support the Scottish economy and our businesses, people and public services in what are and will continue to be very uncertain times. In contrast, just like in the conduct of its negotiations, the UK Government's readiness preparations have been haphazard, contradictory and have massively increased the uncertainty. I confirm, nonetheless, the Scottish Government intends to take a coherent, consistent and collaborative approach to making preparations for EU exit. We will be straight with people, and I intend to communicate what the Scottish Government is doing to help Scotland. Let me start with the details of our preparations in parallel with the UK Government's arrangements. In June, I said I would return to Parliament with more details on how we will legislate to deliver a functioning statute book. That's an unwelcome responsibility, but it's one we'll face up to. We must act just in case we find ourselves in the worst of circumstances. This Chamber will understand that this is a significant undertaking. The deficiencies in our statute book that have already been identified, the areas where change must be made, are many and varied. We need to correct hundreds of pieces of legislation, not a mere handful. But we have no choice. So as parliamentarians, we will have a great deal of heavy legislative lifting to do over the next few months. We've always said that the best way to go about this task would be by cooperation and coordination between the governments of these islands, as long as that cooperation could take place in a way that respected the principles of devolution and gave this Parliament its proper role in the process. Accordingly, where the policy outcome being sought is consistent across governments, we will seek to agree approaches to the fixing regulations required. Of course, where they are not, we will pursue our own policies, which will require us to bring forward our own secondary legislation. Even with that cooperation, the number of individual items for this Parliament to consider may be between 100 and 200 additional instruments. That's a heavy burden. It could be heavier still if Westminster is not willing to cooperate sensibly. I have written today, or I'm writing today, to the conveners of the Constitution and Delegated Powers Committees to set out the Government's approach and agree a protocol between Government and Parliament which will ensure that this Parliament is able to scrutinise effectively the items in question and the whole process. This is not about where the devolved competences will fall after EU exit. This is not about Section 12 of the EU Withdrawal Act, which this Parliament has overwhelmingly rejected, which this Government will have nothing to do with. This is not even about legislative consent motions. This is about responsibly discharging, as best we can, our duty to ensure a functioning, devolved statute book. Now let me turn to some other associated issues. In writing to UK suppliers of over 8,000 medicines, asking them to stockpile up to 6 weeks of supplies, the Secretary of State for Health exposed the scale and complexity of the problems created by a no-deal Brexit. Nonetheless, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and the Chief Medical Officer are engaged in those discussions and will ensure the full involvement of Scotland in that system. We are also constantly reviewing our planning for Brexit more generally, and after the next 2 tranches of technical notices are issued, we will consider publishing our own supplementary guidance if we feel it can be useful and if it does not add to the momentum around a no deal, which could be an unforeseen outcome. And we are, of course, engaged in civil contingencies planning around any impacts which may have an immediate and direct effect on citizens. But in the event of a hard Brexit or no deal, it's important to realise there may be some risks that will simply not be in the hands of the Scottish Government to mitigate. If there are customs delays at the border between the UK and EU, food imports and exports could be delayed and disrupted. Exporters of perishable foods from Scotland, for example, could find their products take longer to get to market or are unable to get there at all and will cost more. In the fight against crime, we stand to lose access to the expertise built up in Europol. This is used to identify, track and disrupt some of the most dangerous cross-border criminal activity. The ability of Police Scotland to work with law enforcement colleagues from across the EU to tackle that can be vital. If free movement of EU nationals and mutual recognition of professional qualifications is curtailed, this would have serious consequences for the recruitment and retention of public sector workers across Scotland. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is aligning existing financial and staff resources towards those areas with specific EU exit-related demands and is ensuring we have the right people in the right places to respond. We've created a new Directorate for International Trade and Investment, strengthened our presence in Brussels, London, Dublin, Berlin and Paris to ensure that Scotland's voice is heard in Europe. Every Directorate of the Scottish Government is engaged in planning for EU exit. The Scottish Government will receive £37.3 million of consequentials allocated in 2018-19. The Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Economy and Fair Work has made initial allocations of funding to support vital activities, which to date total £26.6 million resource and £0.5 million capital. We're prioritising areas heavily impacted by Brexit, such as agriculture and the rural economy. We're also using those funds to ensure that we have the skilled staff in place to resource the delivery of a functioning, devolved statute book. It is, of course, unacceptable that Scotland's public finances should suffer detriment as a result of Brexit, and we'll continue to press the UK Government to ensure that the financial implications of EU exit and the need for appropriate future funding arrangements for Scotland are fully considered. Presiding Officer, preparing for an orderly Brexit has been and will be a major challenge in itself. That displacement of skills and resources will be mirrored across Scotland's businesses and public services. How much worse is it to be forced to also address the prospect of a no-deal Brexit threatening disruption on an unprecedented scale in peacetime? However carefully we prepare for a no-deal scenario, it will still result in chaos. Even the UK government's own no-deal plans will require a plethora of agreements with the EU in order to work effectively. In a situation where negotiations have broken down, we have to ask how plausible that is. I will also keep Parliament updated on preparations and make a further statement in due course. Presiding Officer, a no deal is not inevitable, but the Chequers Agreement is not deliverable and a blind Brexit is not acceptable. So not leaving would be best. And the only acceptable alternative thereafter is continued membership of the Single Market and Customs Union, which is essential for our economy, our society and the people of Scotland. The Scottish Government will continue to make that case whilst fulfilling our duty of protecting Scotland as best we can from the threats of a Brexit, any Brexit, that we cannot completely ameliorate, that we do not want and that we did not vote for.
Presiding Officer, it is important that politicians of all parties put their shoulder to the wheel and secure something as close to the Chequers Agreement as possible. If we step away from that, it will be detrimental to the United Kingdom and to Scotland. Not my words, Presiding Officer, but those just yesterday of NFU Scotland. And the National Farmers Union is right. Why doesn't the Minister agree? What we need from Scottish ministers is not more empty posturing on Brexit, which is all we were just treated to from Mike Russell, but constructive engagement in the work of cooperating with the UK Government to secure the best possible Brexit deal for Scotland and for all of the UK. On one level, Presiding Officer, you do have to feel sorry for Mike Russell. Desperate to be the herald of doom, here he is today contradicted over and again by Michel Barnier himself, no less. The EU's chief negotiator said only yesterday that it is perfectly possible to reach a deal on Brexit within the next 6 to 8 weeks. This is good news, Presiding Officer, but the SNP don't want to hear it. Everything they say about Brexit is negative. The only thing being stockpiled here is ministerial grievance and tired political cliché. Yet, if the outcome is so gloomy, why is the ICA reporting only today that business confidence in the economy is so high? Let's do as NFU Scotland and countless others have rightly said. Let's get behind Chequers, let's support the UK Government in its negotiations with the EU, let's drop the nationalist scaremongering, let's seize the opportunities for economic growth that Brexit presents, and let's get on with the job of securing the best possible Brexit deal for Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I have to echo the words of Brian Taylor on radio this morning, who commended the brass neck of the Tories. We've just heard more of that brass neck today in a party that is literally tearing itself apart over Brexit. All that Adam Tompkins is able to do is to try and create a smokescreen to avoid the chaos that lies ahead. But let me, Presiding Officer, quote somebody else. Let me quote somebody who said on the 28th of June in this Parliament, "To my mind, leave should mean that we retain full access to the EU's single market," who said that leaving the EU's political institutions does not mean we have to leave the EU's single market, for there are several countries, including Norway, that have just such an arrangement. That person was Adam Tompkins. Now, the reality is, and indeed, let me quote somebody else, retaining our place, this is the 30th of June, retaining our place in the single market should be the overriding priority. That was Ruth Davidson. The reality is that the only acceptable alternative, and it's not as good, to staying in the EU is staying in the single market and the customs union. That, unfortunately, is what Adam Tompkins and Ruth Davidson and everybody else knew 2 years ago. The requirements of the Tory party to have slavish loyalty to their leader, apart, of course, from Boris, depends who the leader is, apart from Boris, Rees-Mogg, Redwood and all the others, that requirement is putting Adam Tompkins in a ludicrous position. And the more he shouts, the more ludicrous it becomes.
Neil Findlay.
Thanks, Presiding Officer, and can thank the Cabinet Secretary for the not so early sight of his statement today, but we won't dwell on that. It's interesting that he refers to the claim of right at the beginning of his statement. a claim, of course, that his party failed to sign. But, Presiding Officer, as Brexit Day edges ever closer, businesses, the fishing industry, farmers, workers and our citizens grow ever more anxious. They see the UK Government in complete disarray. Cabinet resignations, threats, counter-threats, a governing party seen out the last months of a war over Europe that's lasted almost 50 years. We see the Prime Minister dangling by her fingertips as Davis, Rees-Mogg and the odious Johnson prise her fingers from the cliff with a sledgehammer, and the already sunk Chequers plan is all she has to keep her afloat. Presiding Officer, a no-deal Brexit would be a disaster for our people, our public services and our businesses, and we oppose the cobbled-together Chequers plan. However, today we are scrutinising the Scottish Government's preparations. We, of course, welcome emergency planning in relation to the NHS and medicines, but we have serious concerns about the lack of detail in other sectors. In this statement, we see a lot of headings and hear plenty of rhetoric, but little in the way of actual practical detail on how the Scottish Government intends providing confidence to businesses, exporters, to workers, farmers, the fishing industry, environmentalists and consumers. They need more than strong rhetoric but vague detail. So will the Cabinet Secretary set out in detail, in spice, what exact progress has been made in each sector so we can properly scrutinise the Scottish Government's proposals?
Before the Cabinet Secretary replies, could I just encourage all members, when answering and asking questions, please refer, if referring to any parliamentarian or any member of the public for the matter, use their full name, address them correctly and politely, and don't disparage them. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, Mr. Finlay has available to him all the detail of the UK documents as they are published. We scarcely get much more detail than that ourselves, except the odd chance to fact or legally check them. And those are the core documents in this matter. I've indicated to him that we will publish additional material as we regard necessary. I've also indicated to him that we will make it clear that our plans are available. But it is quite important, in fact it's very important, that we do two things here. One is that we do not accept the inevitability of a no deal and don't do anything to talk that up. The second one is that we accept where the responsibility for this lies and always say there is an alternative, because there is an alternative, both to no deal or the Chequers agreement, which will not stick, or to the blind Brexit, which appears to be where things are going. The alternative is either to stay in the EU, which is the best option, and that is what Scotland voted for, or to back the single market and the customs union. And indeed, if the Labour Party were to back that, then we would make even more progress with that campaign than we have already done.
Patrick Harvey, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I would also urge the Scottish Government to consider publishing more information, not just supplementary guidance if it feels that is necessary, but reassuring information for members of the public to know that the potential chaos of a no-deal Brexit is being addressed and that preparations are being made in detail. I would like to ask about the continuity bill, because as the Minister knows, he has our support in defending that bill against the attack by the UK Government in the courts. But if he's unsuccessful in that, if the UK Government are successful in attacking that legislation, will he commit to ensure that the stronger aspects of that legislation, which are better as a result of cross-party efforts to achieve social and environmental protections and stronger democratic scrutiny, those aspects will be reintroduced if necessary, that we will not lose out on that higher level of protection and democratic scrutiny if the UK Government have their way in the courts?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I make 2 points in response to that question, Presiding Officer? First, on reassurance. My statement has made it clear we will do and continue to do everything we can to ensure Scotland is protected. But I've also made it clear, and it's essential that we do this, that we cannot mitigate every outcome of a no deal. For 2 reasons. One is we do not know what those outcomes would be, and secondly, a no deal is by definition disastrous. We have made that clear. So I would love to give even more reassurance, but we have to be realistic, as I've indicated. There are things that cannot be mitigated against, and I've indicated what some of those would be. On the continuity bill, I'm entirely in agreement with the member. The attack by the UK Government was most unwelcome, but that having been the case, we have defended ourselves vigorously. Depending on the outcome, of course, we will consider how we will bring to this chamber the ways in which we can undertake the actions we wish to undertake. I do hope that bill is able to move forward and have royal assent. That would be the right thing to happen. And were that to happen, then it's clear we would move forward to it. If that is not the case, then of course I will consider very closely what we could do, and I hope to involve the other parties in this chamber in that, at least those who are not attacking the bill.
The SNP is calling on the UK government to commit to freedom of movement after the UK leaves the EU in order to secure the future of North Sea oil and gas. The call follows a report from Oil and Gas UK which showed that Brexit worker shortages could cause North Sea oil and gas platforms to shut down operations and production. The report confirms that around 5% of the total oil and gas workforce and around 7% of the offshore workforce come from other EU countries. These include skilled engineers that operate emergency response and rescue vehicles. SNP MSP for Aberdeenshire East, Gillian Martin, said there is no need to take the country hurtling towards a harmful hard Brexit regardless of the impact. It is in the interest of both the Scottish and UK economies to guarantee membership of the European Single Market and Customs Union immediately. The European Parliament met today to discuss the situation in Hungary after Prime Minister Viktor Orban's government has been accused of corruption and nepotism. Dutch MEP Judith Sargentini wrote a report into Orban's party launched the debate to see whether it was in breach of the EU's core values. The Prime Minister was met with criticism in his speech whereby he accused the report of insulting the Hungarian nation, calling it an abuse of power. The claim by Jacob Rees-Mogg that no-deal Brexit would boost the UK economy has been rubbished by Owen Smith MP, who said this is desperate stuff from only Rees-Mogg. These random numbers, doodles no doubt on the back of a napkin at his club, are no substitute for a detailed post-Brexit plan. He's right, of course we would be free to import all the cut-price chlorinated chicken and hormone-pumped beef we want under his plans, but I'm not sure that's what people voted for, especially the British farmers whose livelihood would be destroyed by such a cheap food strategy. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered for a Catalonian independence march on La Diada, or Catalan National Day, today. It's the 7th year of the rally took on a special tone following the independence referendum last year, and was also marked by the fact that most of the political and civil leaders involved have now either been imprisoned or are in exile abroad. Referring to the La Diada celebrations, Amar Anwar said, "You, the Catalan people, have built a movement for independence which has always had the principles of internationalism, justice, equality and freedom at its heart. I salute the courage of the political prisoners, the political exiles, your politicians and your lawyers. Silence is not an option for those on the side of justice." The chief executive of Britain's largest car manufacturer, Jaguar Land Rover, Dr Ralph Speth, has attacked Theresa May's Brexit plans at her Birmingham summit today, warning that tens of thousands of jobs in the car industry could be lost if the UK leaves without a deal. Dr Speth said, "We urgently need greater certainty to continue to invest heavily in the UK and safeguard our suppliers, customers and 40,000 British-based employees. A bad Brexit deal would cost Jaguar Land Rover more than £1.2 billion in profit each year. As a result, we would have to drastically adjust our spending profile. 6 months from Brexit and uncertainty means that companies are being forced to make decisions about their businesses that will not be reversed, whatever the outcome, just to survive." Mark Carney will remain Bank of England Governor until the end of January 2020, Chancellor Philip Hammond has told MPs. The Governor had been due to step down from the role at the end of June 2019, 2 years short of the usual 8-year term. The extension was agreed in an exchange of letters between the Governor and the Chancellor, which were published on Wednesday. The Governor said, "I am willing to do whatever I can in order to promote both a successful Brexit and an effective transition at the Bank of England." The number of people out of work and looking for a job in Scotland has fallen again. Official figures from May to July showed that Scotland's jobless total hit 113,000, a 6,000 person drop from February to June. The unemployment rate fell from 4.3 to 4.1%, but was up from 3.8% in the same period last year. Additionally, Scots aged between 16 and 64 have a slightly lower employment rate at 75.1 compared to 75.2 in the previous quarter. Commenting on the statistics, Minister for Business, Fair Work and Skills, Jamie Hepburn, said, While these results show a very slight decrease in employment, comparing these figures against historical trends show Scotland's economy and job market remain strong, despite the continued challenges facing our economy as a result of Brexit uncertainty. We continue to urge the UK Government to commit to remaining in the EU Single Market and Customs Union to protect jobs and investment in Scotland. The first payments of the Best Start Pregnancy and Baby Grant are due to be made before Christmas this year, more than 6 months ahead of schedule. As outlined in the programme for government, the grant will see extra money paid to families on lower incomes and will replace the Department of Work and Pensions Sure Start Maternity Grant. By summer 2019, a further 2 Best Start grant payments of £250 per child will be introduced to help with the cost of early learning at age 2 or 3 and when they start school, in an attempt to decrease child poverty. Social Security Secretary Leanne Somerville said the Best Start Pregnancy and Baby Grant pays more than the Sure Start Maternity Grant. £600 on the birth of a first child and £300 on the birth of any further children, meaning lower income families who are feeling the effects of welfare cuts are given the help that they need. More than 30,000 people have fled their homes in northwest Syria after the Syrian government and allied forces resumed air and ground bombardments there last week. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA, said an all-out military assault on the Idlib province, the last major stronghold of active opposition against President Bashar al-Assad, could cause up to 800,000 people to flee. Russian and Syrian warplanes resumed bombing last week after the presidents of Turkey, Iran and Russia failed to agree on a ceasefire that would forestall the offensive. The OCHA chief, Mark Lowcock, warned that this risks provoking the worst humanitarian catastrophe of the 21st century. The Scottish Football Association will be staying at Hampden after agreeing to buy the National Stadium from Queen's Park. The SFA was previously contemplating moving to Murrayfield, the home of Scottish Rugby, when their lease expires in 2020, but will now take ownership of the ground when the time comes. A deal has been struck to pay the League Two club £5 million for the Glasgow ground, with half of the money to complete the cash takeover pledged by Scottish businessman Lord Willie Hoffey. Queen's Park are set to move their matches to Hampden. Commenting, SFA Chief Executive Ian Maxwell said, "Today is a big day for Scottish football. Hampden Park has been the spiritual home of Scottish football, and for over 100 years it has been central to our sports identity in this country. But today's decision is about the future, not the past. While we are committed to Hampden Park, we also recognise that it needs to change. We have heard the fans' views throughout the process and agree with them that we need to improve access, transport links and the overall experience. We are committed to doing that." That's all for tonight. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Good evening.